G'day, I'm here to let you know that this talk was originally filmed for the Festival of Creativity at the University of Sydney and created for Sutekh. Because our audio and video quality wasn't too great at the night, we thought we'd re-record it so that you can enjoy a higher standard of conversation, but stick around till the end to see our original Q&A from the night and a really flattering video angle of us, I promise. Alright, let's get on with it.
Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us here for our talk. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we do our work, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nations, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today we'll be speaking about a fundamental framework that we use to design our games, and we'll be sharing some areas of thinking that we hope will help you in your own game design. First, I'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm V.
I'm Hayley.
And we design and publish tabletop RPGs together as Storybrewers Role-Playing. We're best known for Good Society, which is a Regency role-playing game that won Game of the Year, Best Rules, and was featured in Dimension 20's A Court of Fae and Flowers. Most recently, we've been working on our one-shot games, and Saltfish and Almanacs, the one right in front there, has recently won Best Rules and is an upcoming feature at PAX Australia's Indie Showcase and South by Southwest Sydney coming up next month. We've produced about 8 or so games by now, and a lot of those were original custom systems. Every single time we've made one of those designs, we always come back to this very simple, very effective idea that we'd love to introduce you to today, and that is, who says what when? This is one of our core fundamental game design principles, adages, and whether you're either hacking an existing game system or you are building something entirely new, I think it's something that's going to be relevant. After all, everything that happens on your game table is a version of who says what when. You know, you've heard that role-playing is a conversation, right? Well, I think as game designers, what we are doing is providing a framework for that conversation to occur, to progress, to delight people on your table. So how that conversation goes ends up providing a specific play experience that makes your game your game. So for the first part of this talk, we're going to cover 3 parts: who says, what, and when. And then after that, we'll talk about how to use all these 3 things together to improve your game.
That's right. So let's kick off with the first part of the phrase, who says. So coming back to this idea that role-playing games are a conversation between the people playing. And as you know from the conversations you've had in life, they can get a bit chaotic, and it's not always clear in a group conversation how everyone is meant to contribute. When you've got 4 or 5 people trying to tell a story together, it isn't easy to know who should be talking. So to prevent this from happening, tabletop games tend to assign people certain roles with certain expectations on them. The most obvious one of these is that of player. Almost every role-playing game will have the player or players who do certain kinds of things in the game. The role of player comes with some default expectations about what you'll do in the conversation. For example, you expect to play a character. You expect to describe what your character does. You expect someone else will explain the rules to you and tell you how to play, right? And these expectations begin to tell you how you should contribute to the conversation. And you can take advantage of these expectations to help people know how to play your game. However, just because there are typical expectations of what a player does, doesn't mean you have to stick to them in your game. You have the power to change the rules that are present in the game and their job so that they can contribute to the conversation differently. For example, in the game The Quiet Year, which is about a year in the life of a community, players don't play characters at all, but rather take charge of the community as a whole. However, it's worth noting that if you do change up the expectations, your game will need to help players to do so. Let's think about this in relation to another very common role in role-playing games: the Dungeon Master or Game Master. The Dungeon Master or Game Master is a special role with a lot of assigned responsibility. Generally, we expect the person who is the DM or GM will be the one talking most in the conversation, and that's because they're typically responsible for 2 kinds of tasks. Firstly, facilitated tasks. That is, things like explaining the rules, moving the spotlight, pacing the session, and helping players to collaborate, those kind of things. Secondly, there's narrative tasks, where the DM or GM is playing the world, or everything outside the player characters, and is describing stuff, and is playing all the bad guys and that kind of thing. And a lot of games that come out of an older game tradition, like everyone's most well-known fantasy role-playing game, Dungeons & Dragons, are games that use this traditional model. One alternative to a DM or GM is the facilitator. The facilitator, who could be referred to by different names in different games, is essentially a person who just does the facilitator tasks that I mentioned previously, but not the narrative tasks, or at least not all of them. And Good Society works this way. So it's a game with a facilitator that helps players collaborate, but all the actual content of the Austen story that you tell comes from the players themselves. Not every game has or needs a DM or GM, or even a facilitator. These tasks can be distributed in different ways. For instance, there are games that distribute these tasks equally among the players, GM-less games, and The Quiet Year that I mentioned earlier is one of these games. Or there are even more asymmetrical role-playing games where players take on roles that give them completely different responsibilities. An example of this is The Companion's Tale, where you take on different roles in different rounds, such as witness, historian, and cartographer. And depending on your role, you do a whole different set of tasks, from annal writing to map drawing. And we'll get into the different kinds of tasks that roles can do more deeply when we talk about the what. But you can already start to see how your game can use different roles to shape the conversation. On top of that, there is another who that contributes a lot to the conversation, and that is your game. It also says things and has an influence on the story. You actively need to think about how your game is participating in the conversation. So some games only say a little, like OSR games such as the Black Hack, who sort of give you a basic set of rules and then doesn't say that much more while you're playing. On the other extreme, some games say a lot all the time, and The King is Dead is a great example of that. This game is divided into mini-games, and what you do during a mini-game is you play out the instructions step by step. So the game is doing a lot of talking and is in fact structuring every moment of the conversation that you are having.
Awesome. So now that we've sort of gone through the voices in the conversation, the who's, we are going to be talking about the what. This is the content of your game, the full scope of things that are going to be said or done in your game. And it is often seen as like on-screen content, but also includes other contributions outside of that. So one way to think about the what is to separate this idea of narrative authority versus directorial authority. Narrative authority is the ability to insert fiction into the game. What are people allowed to make up? What new truths can they invent about the world? Can they insert new fiction about their character? Where is the boundary, basically, of what they're able to create or narrate? How is narrative authority different for different roles in your game? In D&D, players have a lot of narrative authority over their own characters, but comparatively little over the world around them. So much so they're separated into, the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. In Fall of Magic, the game provides a loose map, a huge rollout map of locations to journey through. That's what the game provides, but the players have full narrative authority over the lore and histories of these places that they are journeying through. So we tend to love giving players lots of narrative control. One thing we've noticed, though, is too much narrative control without enough grounding elements can lead to a lack of focus in the game, or too much of the story splintering into little different stories that people are telling. And so it's a bit of a balancing act to give people a lot of narrative authority, but for that to make a collaborative, cohesive narrative. So in our game, Saltfish and Almanacs, you can see an example of how the game hands over the narrative control to players in this very specific way. When you unload a good from your wagon, you are interacting with this unloading prompt that is on the card. There's a brief context that's presented with then questions under that asking players to contribute to the story in a specific way. They're going to have full narrative control of answering these questions and then fleshing out the scene, but within very defined bounds initially, so they know so they have something to start off. In contrast to this, directorial authority is the ability to control what is on screen. So who chooses what scenes are coming up next? What characters are in focus? When can new people enter the scene? When does the scene end? So most typically, directorial authority is given over to the GM or facilitator of the game, but there are many other ways to handle and approach this as a game designer. In our mundane supernatural life, the scenes are set up in the beginning of the game chronologically, so the game essentially presents what scenes are next. A good principle to keep in mind when designing this is clear but collaborative. It's good for directorial authority to be clearly set out so that the game doesn't stall with a group being lost about what's coming up next or knowing what to do next, but also collaborative enough so that everyone is able to have their voice heard. We find this helpful in making games that feel very much like we are all telling the story together without putting too much on any one person. Okay, so it can also be useful to think more broadly about this idea of what, as in what contributions does your game seek from the players? This is an area where you can really start flexing your creativity. Most games will want players to input some sort of like, I want my character to do this, but that is not the only inputs that we can consider. So a few examples: in A Quiet Year, you add drawings to further the fiction. In Dread, you're pulling out Jenga blocks from a tower. And in Good Society's epistolary phase, you're writing letters from your characters.
Okay, so that's the what. Let's move on to the when. So we know who's going to be saying things, we know what they're going to be saying, but when are they going to be saying it? Or, to look at this question another and perhaps more helpful way, how is different content in the conversation triggered? Broadly, there's 3 ways that content can be triggered in your game. It can be triggered by the game itself. For example, when the card deck runs out, your story is over. And that approach is great for highly structured games that are aiming for a very specific experience, especially one-shots that need to take players through the story in a short amount of time. And For the Queen is a very classic example of this. So on your turn, you draw a card, and then you answer the question in the card. And that's what you do in the game. So the game is saying, do this, do this, do this. A second way that the when can be triggered is by a person deliberately engaging with your game's mechanics. For example, in a classic fantasy game, when a person wants to cast Fireball, they're going to be pulling out their spellcasting rules and going from there. And if a person wants to lockpick a door, a DM might decide to call for a dexterity check, triggering that rule in the game. But there is other examples of that in more collaborative games. For example, Good Society's monologue token. So you're going to play this token on someone when you want to hear their character monologue, engaging this monologue rule. So this method of triggering content is great for 2 things. Firstly, a situation when someone needs to exercise judgment. So in the Fireball example, maybe a player can see the combat map and they're thinking, oh, what's the best attack for me? They're exercising judgment. Secondly, when you want to let players choose what kind of content they want to engage in. So you want to engage in the monologuing, you play the monologue token, right? For either of these to be effective, it has to be a genuine choice. So if you're in combat and all you can do is hit something with a sword, you're still going to say, I hit it with a sword, triggering the rule. But since you had no other choice, it's really the game that's triggering this content. And it's worth noting that kind of as we got out in the what section, different roles may be able to trigger different kinds of content. The third way that content can be triggered in your game is just by a person playing naturally and pursuing what they believe should happen next in the story. And this is where the people who are playing may not even be aware that they're engaging with the mechanics, or maybe they are aware, but it's a secondary focus in the moment. For example, in a game of Burning Wheel, your character has important beliefs, and these beliefs are part of the game design. And during a game, a player might have their character act on one of these beliefs, not because it's a mechanical part of the game, but just because it informs that player's sense of who the character is. And these kinds of mechanics are all about giving players a reason to act or a basis to act upon. And for that reason, they are just as important in a game as knowing what happens when you try to hit someone with a sword, right? Because these are going to be responsible for a surprisingly large part of the content of the game itself. And also, players or GMs or other roles in your game can use these to drive the story forward. If these are absent from your game, then someone is going to need to fill in the blanks. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a deliberate decision that you need to make when designing your game if you want this to be the case. And you really need to support people to be able to do that. So, for example, every time a GM invents a quest for the players, they are filling in the blanks. And they might have a quest worksheet, or maybe they have a book of lore to help them invent that and to help them fill in the blanks. That makes doing that process a bit easier.
Awesome. So, putting it all together, we've talked a lot today about the who, the what, and the when. But obviously the truth is these concepts do not exist individually. In any game, they're going to be interrelated, and thinking about them holistically is in the context of your specific design is what is going to help improve it. So to illustrate that, we're going to take a quick dive into 3 important considerations in any game that sort of use this idea of who says what when. These are just examples of considerations, as who says what when can influence many different aspects of your game beyond these starter ideas. The first one that we're going to talk about today is spotlight. It's a pretty common, easy idea to get in your head, which is just that you imagine a giant spotlight appearing on the person who's doing the story and the talking, and how much does the spotlight shine on each person. Spotlight really has 2 parts. The first is how much does each person actually talk? And the second being, how much does the narrative center around the creations, whether that be a character or a dungeon or whatever it is, of each person involved. Ideally, you want this to be somewhat equal so that everyone has a positive experience. And when you are designing a game, you can manipulate the spotlight with who says what when. For example, if you think about the who, you're thinking who gets to speak now in the game. What, whose character or characters is the game focused on right now? And when. So how do people know when it is time for them to talk, or when the game should be focusing on a different character or person?
The next thing we wanted to talk about as an example is flow. So we mentioned earlier in the talk that an RPG is a conversation, and in an ideal world, this conversation flows smoothly from one thing to the next without too many awkward pauses and uncertainties. However, when it comes to RPGs, that doesn't just magically happen. Maintaining flow in the game leans a lot on your who says what when. And if you find that people are getting stuck when they're playing your game and they don't really know what to say next, it can be really helpful to look at it through this framework. So who? Do people know whose turn it is to speak? What? Do people know what kind of input is needed next in the game? And do they know how they should provide it? And when? Is it the right time for this thing now? Are people expecting it? Do they know what to do with it? The next example, and this is something that almost every game has to consider, is mental load. So a person can only hold a certain amount of things in their head at one time before they have trouble making decisions or keeping track, right? And the more of the who, what, and when you place on one person, the more difficulty they're going to have managing it all. And some things are going to get lost. So how many times you've been playing an RPG or a board game and you've forgotten to use a power or ability you have just because you're thinking about so many other things and you're like, damn, I could have won. But you don't say that because you want everyone else to get upset that you could have won because you didn't use your power or ability. So classic mental load situation. So to address this mental load, you can take some of the who, what, when burden and place it on either other people or on the game itself. So, for example, who has to do the thing? Creating new roles in your game other than just GM and player can help to distribute the mental load. So, for example, you could have a lore keeper that keeps track of the lore. What? Simple question is who plays NPCs? Games like Fiasco, Triangle Agency, and Good Society distribute at least some of the NPCs among the players, so that one person doesn't have to bear the burden of keeping track of them all. And then when? Who has to remember when things happen? If players in your game can change their core belief or instinct at any time, that can make it difficult for players to remember to do so. If instead there's a particular step in the game where players can make that change, that moves the mental load from the players to the game. And these things we've talked about with spotlight, flow, and mental load, these are just examples, but there are countless ways to use who, what, and when to improve your game.
So today we've talked about who says what when as 3 important considerations that can elevate your game design, and 3 concepts flowing from that: spotlight, flow, and mental load. Chances are, if you're designing a game, you're already intuitively making choices about all these things, maybe without even realizing it. That's certainly our experience of making games. But by setting a conscious intention for who, what, and when, you can start to use these to achieve your game's goals and improve the overall experience of the game. So one last thing before we do wrap up is this idea of playtest. We love playtesting.
Playtest.
Thinking about who says what when in the abstract is very good and very important. But because it is a conversation-focused frame of analysis, playtesting is vitally important in applying this to your game. Through testing, you'll be able to see the impact of your game's design on the conversation and learn how you need to tweak your rules to better meet your own game design intentions or objectives. You really, really can't know who will say what when unless you listen to the players actually doing it. Thank you so much for your time today and for dropping in for this little talk of ours. We're going to cut now to the question and answer portion as it was taken and filmed during the day. So please excuse the kind of audio video part of that talk. We're in a pretty big hall, so we're just doing our best there. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
We will take some questions.
There have been times that you've used it in abstract and brought it to the playtest, and it's different, and if so, how do you respond to that?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, when has it been the same?
Yeah, when has it been? When has it been the same? No, I think you do get better at answering the same. Like, I would say there have been oftentimes the more original, or like the more weird our original idea, the more unlikely that we are correct in our assumption of what will happen.
Yeah.
But once we've gotten like things that are related, so then like once we understand how something works, there's more chances that things close to that will get right again.
The one that will get you every time is always going to be the when, because there's almost certainly going to be things in your game that people either never reach for because they don't understand when they're meant to reach for that thing, or they just forget about it, or things that people really, really want to reach for, and they keep reaching for them, and you're like, you've done that 5 times in the last half an hour, and you're not really, like, that's kind of just making the whole game that one thing, which can be fine if you want your whole game to be that one thing, but, you know, usually it isn't. So, yeah, I think just that process of watching and seeing what people do, that's why it can be so helpful.
I think also as we've sort of gotten like further in our design journey, the who's involved, we kind of like tend to do earlier in our process these days. Like, because I feel like if you outline it yourself, and it could be an empty box, like if you draw a role in your mind and there's nothing there, but the fact that you have this shell that later on as you're designing, you're like putting things into or moving things around, it can be helpful to just like think about the different actors that might play a part in your game. Earlier on, so that's something that we started doing more of.
Yeah, one example of that I think is that like with our games now, we generally want everybody to be able to play like in, you know, sort of as an equal. Like you might have one person who's doing more of a facilitatory role, but everyone should be able to contribute narrative content. And so, you know, to make that work, we've been thinking about roles that the person who is the facilitator could play in the narrative to allow them to both facilitate and play. So in our game that is coming out like next week or the week after, Fight with Spirit, which is like a sports drama game, the facilitator also plays a character from the rival team, so they can kind of like get in and they do everything that the normal characters do, but they're on a rival team, so they can be you know, gloating and various other important things in sports dramas. And in an upcoming game we're working on, which is sort of a legal drama game, and the facilitator can play either a lawyer, depending on how many players there are, or they can play an investigator who's sort of like just contributing to the narrative in little ways throughout. So yeah, I think having an idea of those roles has been really helpful. That was a really long answer.
Is there a where aspect to your game design? Like, I know this was deciding, I think it was deciding Playtesting, we should have the guys on there. Very much set at that kitchen table. But it was also very much in a sort of career play
Yeah.
something else. Like,
If
do
there's-
you think about that where aspect? Like,
It should be appended on there. Where is also a really important question. I think oftentimes we do already think in our minds we know where the where are, which is so we do tailor stuff on it, but it's not like constantly we're asking ourselves these questions as we're designing. Another way that I think where is important these days is like online
that's actually
and
huge.
digital
We actually do spend a
games,
lot of
but
time
so
thinking
much-
about that.
So, yeah, actually, we went through a whole thing because now you need to figure out how your game's going to be at a table and what materials are happening there. But like, how is this going to translate to a digital experience? And is that digital experience going to be like the same, analogous, or different? Like, because there are pros and cons to playing in person and playing online.
Yeah.
And sometimes you kind of do need to make that decision, maybe even on a game by game basis. About what's the digital implementation going to look like, or not even as an afterthought these days. It's kind of like both.
And sometimes on a mechanic by mechanic basis, like Fight with Spirit has cards in both the digital and physical version, but Good Society has cards in the physical version but not the digital version because they just slowed down digital play too much. And the way the game works is that there are alternatives to them in the digital space that mean you don't need them.
You don't need them as actual cards.
Yeah, as actual cards.
In
You
that
do
kind
need
of
the
form.
content.
Yeah. So yeah, it is something that more and more we see most of the games are being played online.
Yeah.
So it is very,
That is
very
actually a
important.
good point.
Yeah.